The bridge of the diplomatic ship was quiet, and Ambassador Krethar stood by the window looking at the ice planet below, and his 3 eyes watched the planet spin slowly, and they had come here to talk. Not to die, but something felt wrong, and he could feel it in his bones. Lieutenant Velamora sat at her station, and her claws clicked on the controls, and she turned to face him, and her voice was shaking when she spoke, and she said that the Vraxan fleet had arrived, and there were 15 warships, and they were charging their weapons. Krethar felt his blood run cold, and he knew what the Vraxans were, and they were raiders and slavers, and they were known across the galaxy for being cruel, and the Zathani people were peaceful, and their ships had almost no weapons, and against 15 warships they had no chance at all. He told Velamora to send a distress call and use the Galactic Council frequency, and broadcast it to any allied ship that could hear them, and send it at maximum power, and his voice was steady. Even though he was afraid, Velamora worked fast, and her claws moved across the controls, and she said the message was transmitting, but the nearest council patrol was 3 days away, and they did not have 3 days, and maybe not even 3 hours. The window flashed bright, and a plasma bolt flew past their ship, and it was a warning shot. And then a rough voice came through the speakers, and it spoke in Galactic Common, but the accent was heavy, and the voice said, to power down the engines and prepare to be boarded, and if they resisted, the Vraxans would take what was left of the crew. As salvage, Krethar closed his eyes for a moment, and he told Velamora to keep transmitting the distress call, and use every frequency they had, and maybe someone would hear them before the end came. The Vraxan ships moved closer, and they looked like predators circling prey, and the harmonious dawn was surrounded, and there was no escape. And Krethar thought about his family back home, and he wondered if they would ever know what happened here. Then Velamora made a sound, and she said she was detecting a response to their distress call, and there were unknown ships coming, and they were appearing from hyperspace. And the bearing was 271. Krethar felt hope rise in his chest, and he asked if they were council ships and what was their identification. Velamora stared at her screen, and her face showed confusion and then disbelief, and she said these were not council vessels, and the signatures did not match any known allied fleet, and according to the database, these ships belonged to a species called humans, and they came from a planet called Earth, and they were listed as newly contacted, and the classification said Deathworld origin. Krethar felt a chill run through him, and the word Deathworld was rare in galactic records, and it was used only for the most dangerous planets where life was hard and survival required extreme adaptations. And he had heard stories about such worlds and places where gravity crushed bones and predators hunted in darkness, and the air itself could kill you. The window lit up as 12 massive ships appeared, and they tore into normal space, and their hulls were angular and brutal-looking, and weapons covered every surface. And they were nothing like the smooth, elegant council ships. And these ships looked like they were built for only one thing. And that thing was war. A new voice came through the speakers, and it was calm and measured and spoke perfect Galactic Common. And the voice said this was Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense ship Valkyrie, and they had received the distress call and told them to hold position, and they would engage the hostile forces. Krethar found his voice, and he said they were grateful. But Captain Morrison needed to know there were 15 Vraxan warships, and they were heavily armed, and he did not want the humans to sacrifice themselves. There was a pause, and then Krethar heard a sound that he would later learn was human laughter, and Morrison said they appreciated the concern. But 15 ships was a light fight by human standards, and he told his squadron that weapons were free, and they would show these raiders why you don't threaten innocent people. The human fleet moved with frightening precision, and they did not charge wildly or spread out in defense, and instead they flew straight at the Vraxan ships, and they closed the distance, at speeds that made the navigation officer cry out in alarm. The Vraxan commander did not take the humans seriously, and his voice growled across the channel, and he said the unknown vessels had made a grave mistake and told them to stand down or share the fate of the Zathani captain. Morrison's response was cold as ice, and he said the Vraxans had fired on an unarmed diplomatic vessel and threatened innocents, and that was their mistake. The first attack from the human ships lit up space, like a newborn star, and these were not plasma bolts or particle beams like most weapons in the galaxy, and these were solid projectiles moving at speeds close to light and missiles that moved through space with impossible skill. And the lead Vraxan warship's shields flared and collapsed in seconds, and the second wave of fire tore through the hull and the ship broke apart in explosions. Velmora whispered that by the ancestors, they had destroyed it in one pass. The Vraxan fleet tried to fight back, and they fired everything they had, but the human ships moved like nothing Krethar had ever seen, and they rolled and turned and accelerated with moves that should have killed any crew inside, and yet they kept fighting, and their weapons never stopped. 2 more Vraxan ships exploded, and then 3 more, and the raiders were trying to run now, and their engines burned at maximum power, but the humans were faster, and they hunted down each ship with cold efficiency in less than 10 minutes. It was over, and 15 Vraxan warships were reduced to debris and radiation, and the human fleet moved back into formation around the Harmonious Dawn, and they held position like they had just finished a routine patrol. Captain Morrison's voice returned, and it was still calm, and he said the immediate threat was neutralized and asked if they needed medical help or repairs. Krethar realized he had been holding his breath, and he said they were unharmed but shaken, and he asked how the humans had responded so quickly because the distress call had only just gone out. Morrison said they were doing patrol exercises 2 systems over when they picked up the signal and came at best speed, and if the ambassador was able, they would like to establish formal communications because it seemed they had much to discuss. Krethar looked at the 12 warships floating in formation, and their weapons still glowed hot from combat, and these humans and these Deathworlders had arrived like avenging spirits and destroyed a superior force without hesitation, and the galaxy had no idea they existed. The transport shuttle that brought Captain Jake Morrison to the Harmonious Dawn was different from any craft Krethar had seen, and it was compact and angular, and function mattered more than beauty, and the airlock opened with a hiss, and 3 humans stepped aboard. Captain Morrison was tall by Zathani standards, and he had dark hair and intense blue eyes that seemed to record everything in an instant, and he wore a dark blue uniform with symbols Krethar did not recognize. And beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Sophie Grant, and she was a woman with sharp features and auburn hair pulled tight, and Dr. Alex Chen, who had kind eyes and medical marks on his collar. Morrison held out his hand, and Krethar would learn. This was a human greeting, and Morrison said it was an honor to meet him, and he apologized for the circumstances. Krethar carefully copied the gesture, and his 3-fingered hand was wrapped by Morrison's larger one, and he said the captain had saved their lives, and there was no need to apologize, and asked them to come to the conference room because they had much to discuss. As they walked through the corridors of the Harmonious Dawn, Krethar could not help but notice how the humans moved, and there was a controlled intensity to their steps, and a readiness that suggested they were always aware of everything around them, and even here on a peaceful ship they seemed prepared for danger. In the conference chamber, Krethar turned on the holographic display and brought up a map of local space, and Lieutenant Velmora and Science Officer Dalmoth joined them, and 2 human officers stood near the door, and their hands stayed close to the weapons on their hips. Krethar sat down and began to speak, and he said they knew very little about the human species, and their database listed Earth as newly contacted and classified as a death world, but there were few other details. And how did they have ships capable of such devastating combat power? Morrison looked at Commander Grant before responding, and he said that Earth was contacted by the Galactic Council about 20 standard years ago, and they were considered too primitive for full membership, but they were given access to basic galactic databases and communication systems and told to develop their society and reapply in a century or 2. Dalmoth's ears went flat with confusion, and he said their ships and weapons were far beyond what a newly contacted species should have. And how was this possible? Dr. Chen leaned forward, and his face was thoughtful, and he said the ambassador needed to understand that Earth was not like most worlds in the galaxy, and their planet had high gravity, and a dangerous atmosphere, and an ecosystem full of predators, and humans evolved in an environment where everything wanted to kill them, and they learned to fight back. And when the Council made contact, they realized very quickly that galactic technology was advanced, but it was designed by species from gentle worlds and peaceful worlds. Krethar said slowly that they adapted the technology and took what the Council shared and turned it into weapons. Morrison nodded and said, not out of aggression but out of necessity. And they reviewed galactic history and saw how species like the Vraxans operated as raiders and slavers and pirates, and they saw how the Council responded, and it was slow and bureaucratic, and they decided that if they were going to venture into the galaxy, They needed to defend themselves and defend others if necessary. Velmora spoke up and her voice was hesitant, and she said she had reviewed the sensor logs from the battle, and the human ships had taken direct hits from Vraxan plasma cannons, and those weapons could melt through Council standard shielding, and yet the human vessels barely registered damage. And she asked how Commander Grant answered this time and said their ships were built differently, and most galactic vessels focused on speed and efficiency and were designed for exploration, not prolonged combat. But human ships were heavily armored with backup systems and divided hulls, and they designed them to take punishment and keep fighting. Because on Earth, that was what survival required. Krethar felt a chill and said they came from a world that taught them to endure punishment and strike back harder, and no wonder they were classified as Deathworlders. Morrison said yes, simply, but they did not seek conflict, and they came to the ambassador's aid because it was the right thing to do, and they believed in protecting those who could not protect themselves, and it was a core principle of their species. Krethar studied the human captain, and there was honesty in his words, but also a hardness and a determination that spoke of a people who had faced extinction and refused to give up. And he said he must report this encounter to the Galactic Council, and they would want to know that humanity had developed such capabilities. Morrison leaned back in his chair and said they expected as much, and they were not hiding. And in fact, they had been trying to open formal diplomatic channels with the Council for years, but their requests had been met with delays and dismissals. And it seemed the galaxy was not eager to recognize a species from a Deathworld. Krethar said that might change now, and what they did today in destroying 15 warships without casualties would send shockwaves through the Council, and they would want to understand what humanity represented. Morrison asked quietly what they represented. Krethar thought carefully about his words and said they represented something the galaxy had not seen in a very long time, and a species that was both powerful and principled, and a species that did not hesitate to protect the weak, even at great personal risk. But they also represented fear, because if humans could do what they did today, then they were capable of far more, and the galaxy would need to decide whether to welcome them as allies or regard them as a threat. Morrison met his gaze evenly and said, then they would prove themselves worthy of trust, and humanity had no desire to conquer or dominate, and they simply wanted to take their place among the stars. And if that meant defending those who could not defend themselves, then so be it. Krethar nodded slowly and said he would carry their message to the Council, but he must warn them that there were factions within the Council that would not welcome their presence, and they would see their strength as a challenge to the established order, and they might find that the galaxy was more dangerous than anticipated, and not because of raiders like the Vraxans, but because of politics and fear. Commander Grant said they were prepared for that, and humans had been dealing with politics and fear for thousands of years, and they would adapt, because they always did. As the meeting ended and the humans prepared to return to their ship, Krethar found himself both hopeful and worried, and humanity had arrived in the galaxy like a storm, and they were powerful and unyielding, and the question was whether the galaxy would embrace that storm or try to destroy it, and he suspected it would be the latter, and he feared for what would come next. The Galactic Council chambers on the Station Nexus Prime were designed to inspire awe, and it was a massive circular hall with tiered seating for representatives from hundreds of species, and all arranged beneath a clear dome that showed the swirling nebula beyond, and it was a place meant for careful thought and discussion of the galaxy's most important matters, but today it was a place of chaos. Ambassador Krethar stood at the central podium, and his report appeared on every screen in the chamber, and the holographic footage of the battle played over and 12 human ships destroying 15 Vraxan warships in minutes, and the delegates watched in stunned silence, and then erupted into argument. Councillor Threnzik rose from his seat, and he was a tall insect-like being from the Korthian collective, and his mandibles clicked rapidly as he spoke, and he said this was unacceptable, and a species they dismissed as primitive had somehow developed weapons capable of overwhelming established military forces. And how was this allowed to happen? Krethar kept his voice calm and said the humans developed their technology using information freely available in the galactic database, and they violated no laws, and they merely adapted what they learned to suit their needs. Threnzik's voice rose to a shrill pitch, and he said adapted, and they turned peaceful exploration technology into instruments of war, and this was precisely why Deathworld species were monitored so carefully, and they brought violence with them wherever they went. Another delegate spoke up, and Counselor Mira Solene from the peaceful Eurasian Republic, and her voice was soft and almost musical, and she said with respect, "The humans did not start the violence, and they responded to a distress call and defended an innocent vessel, and was that not the kind of behavior they should encourage?" Threnzik hissed and said defended, and they destroyed 15 ships without offering terms of surrender. And that was not defense but extermination. Krethar spoke up and said the Vraxans were known slavers and murderers, and they had raided dozens of systems and killed thousands, and the humans eliminated a clear and present threat, and had they hesitated, his crew and he would be dead or worse. High Counselor Oren Vale raised a hand for silence, and the chamber grew quiet, and Oren was one of the oldest living beings in the council, and his silver skin was marked with glowing lines that pulsed gently as he thought, and when he spoke his voice carried weight, and he said they should not descend into panic, and the humans acted to save lives, and that much was clear, but they must also acknowledge the concern raised by Counselor Threnzik, and a species with such military capability represented a potential threat if they chose to become one, and the question before them was simple. And what did they do about humanity? Counselor Jax Tanner leaned forward, and he was humanoid from the Keltor Union, and he said they should invite humanity to formal membership in the council, and if they were already operating in galactic space, it was better to have them as allies than as wildcards. Threnzik snapped and said absolutely not, and granting them membership would give them access to even more advanced technology and more resources, and they would be arming a potential aggressor. Mira Solen countered gently and said, or they would be bringing them into a system that valued peace and cooperation, and isolation would only breed mistrust, and if humanity felt excluded, they might become the very threat they feared. The debate went on for hours, and some delegates argued for sanctions and others for surveillance, and still others for outright military action to force humanity to disarm, and Krethar listened and grew increasingly frustrated, and these beings safe in their comfortable chambers had no understanding of what humanity represented, and they saw only power and assumed evil intent. Finally, High Counselor Oren Vale called for order and said enough, and they would take no hasty action, and he proposed they send an official delegation to Earth and meet with their leaders and understand their intentions and assess whether they could be brought into the galactic community, and until then they would maintain their current stance, and humanity was neither enemy nor ally, and they were an unknown variable, and they would treat them with caution. The motion passed through not unanimously, and Krethar left the chamber with a heavy heart, and he had hoped for a warmer reception and for the council to see humanity as he did, as protectors, not predators, but politics he knew rarely aligned with hope. Later that cycle, in a private meeting room, Krethar met with Captain Morrison through a secure holographic link, and the human looked tired but composed. Morrison said, "Ambassador," and he took it. The council did not greet the report with enthusiasm. Krethar said wearily that would be an understatement, and they were sending a delegation to Earth, but it was clear that many saw the human species as a threat, and they feared their strength. Morrison replied and said they expected that, and fear was a natural reaction to the unknown, but they would not change who they were to please the council, and humanity would not give up their weapons simply because it made others comfortable, and they had learned too many lessons about the cost of being unprepared. Krethar said he understood, but Morrison should know there were factions within the council who would push for action against them, and not militarily, perhaps, but through sanctions and embargoes and political isolation, and they would try to force them to comply. Morrison smiled faintly and said, "Let them try," and humanity did not claw its way to the stars to be told what to do by those who had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival, and if the council wanted to exclude them, then they would make their own path, and they would protect those who needed protection with or without council approval. Krethar felt admiration and worry, and said they might find themselves alone in the galaxy, and was that a burden humanity was willing to bear? Morrison said quietly that humanity had always been alone, and they were used to it, but they would not let that stop them from doing what was right, and if the galaxy came to see them as friends rather than threats, then that was a victory, and if not, they would endure because they always had. The hologram ended, and Krethar was left alone with his thoughts, and he realized then that the galaxy was about to learn a hard truth, and you could not intimidate a species that had already survived the worst their own world could throw at them, and you certainly could not control them. The Galactic Council delegation arrived at Earth aboard the diplomatic cruiser Harmony's Light, and it was a sleek vessel designed to impress with elegant lines and a polished hull that gleamed under the light of Sol, and Counselor Mira Solene led the delegation, and she was accompanied by Security Chief Lauren Craik and Science Advisor Talus Venn, and at his own insistence, Ambassador Creetharaz. They descended toward Earth. The delegates crowded around the windows, eager for their first glimpse of the death world, and what they saw took their breath away. And Earth was beautiful, with swirling white clouds and vast blue oceans and continents covered in green, and it looked peaceful, almost perfect. Talus Venn was a scientist who had studied dozens of worlds, and he shook his head in disbelief and said, "This could not be classified as a death world, and to look at it because it was paradise." Creethar had studied human history during the journey, and said quietly, not to let the beauty fool them, and beneath those clouds were storms that could tear their ship apart. And those oceans contained predators larger than their vessels, and the gravity would make it hard for them to even walk on the surface without help. Lauren Craik was a large, battle-scarred warrior from a species known for their strength, and he laughed and said he had fought in wars across the sector and did not fear a little extra gravity. Creethar replied that he would. They landed at the human capital, complex in a city called Geneva on the continent of Europe, and as they left the ship, the delegation was greeted by a line of human leaders, and at the front was Secretary General Linda Harper, and she was a calm woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes, and beside her stood Captain Jake Morrison, now serving as the human contact. Harper stepped forward, and her voice was warm but formal, and she said on behalf of humanity she welcomed them to Earth, and they were honored by the visit and eager to discuss their future relationship with the Galactic Council. Mira Solene returned the greeting with grace and said they came in the spirit of understanding and cooperation, and the galaxy had much to learn about humanity, and they hoped this visit would be the first step toward trust. The tour began in the council chambers, where human leaders explained their history and culture and goals, and the delegates listened politely, but it was clear that many of them were doubtful, and Lauren Craik in particular seemed unimpressed. During a break in the discussions, Craik approached Morrison and said he had reviewed the combat footage from the fight with the Vraxans, and it was impressive, he admitted, but he questioned whether the human species truly understood the nature of galactic conflict, and they had fought 15 raiders, and that was hardly a war. Morrison looked at him calmly and said, humanity had fought wars for thousands of years, and wars that consumed entire continents, and killed millions and pushed them to the edge of extinction, and they understood conflict very well, and perhaps better than Craik realized. Craik said words were easy, but actions were what mattered, and if Morrison truly wished to prove their worth, perhaps he would agree to a demonstration and a sparring match to see if humans were as strong as their ships. Morrison looked at Harper, who gave a small nod, and he turned back to Craik and said, very well, but he would choose the terms, and they would use training weapons and non-lethal force, and they would stop when one of them yielded. Craik agreed with a grin and told Morrison to prepare himself. The match was held in a training facility beneath the council complex, and the delegates gathered to watch, and they were curious to see how a human would fight against a seasoned warrior like Craik. The two fighters faced each other on the mat, and Craik was larger and heavier with dense muscle and thick skin that could take punishment, and Morrison, by comparison, looked almost weak. The match began, and Craik charged forward, confident in his strength, but Morrison stepped to the side, moving with smooth precision, and struck at Craik's knee, and the security chief stumbled, but recovered quickly, and swung a massive fist, but Morrison ducked under the blow and hit back at Craik's ribs and then his throat. Craik staggered, and surprise showed in his eyes, and he changed his approach, becoming more careful, but Morrison was relentless and used speed and skill to make up for the size difference, and he moved like water flowing around Craik's attacks and striking with surgical precision. Within minutes, Morrison had Craik in a submission hold, and his arm was locked at an angle that would cause injury if he did not yield. Morrison let him go and stepped back and asked if the chief yielded. Craik rubbed his arm, breathing hard, and for a moment there was tension in the air. And then the security chief laughed deep and rumbling and said he yielded, and Morrison had proven his point, and humans were not to be taken lightly. The delegates talked among themselves, clearly impressed, and Talus Ven approached Morrison and asked how it was that a species from a high-gravity world could move with such speed, and it went against normal understanding. Morrison explained that on Earth they evolved to survive, and high gravity made them strong, and predators made them fast, and constant threats made them adaptable, and they did not have the advantages of many galactic species, but they learned to compensate, and they fought smarter, not just harder. Mira Selen stepped forward and said she believed she spoke for the delegation when she said they had misjudged humanity. And they were not warlike by nature, but survivors. And survivors, as history had shown, were often the best protectors. Morrison said thank you, and that was all they asked, and to be seen for what they were not, what others feared they might become, as the delegation prepared to leave Earth. Crethar found himself speaking with Secretary General Harper in private, and he said he believed the Council would recommend formal membership for humanity. And the question was, would they accept it? Harper smiled and said, they had always wanted to be part of the galactic community, but they would not join as lesser members, and humanity would bring its strengths to the Council and use them to protect those who could not protect themselves. And if the Council could accept it, then yes, they would join. Crethar promised he would make sure they did as the Harmony's light lifted off from Earth. The delegates looked back at the blue world below, and they had come expecting to find a dangerous species, but instead, they had found something far more valuable, and they had found hope. 6 months after the delegation's visit to Earth, the Galactic Council formally extended membership to humanity, and it was a historic moment celebrated across the galaxy as a symbol of unity and cooperation. But not everyone was pleased. The Krellian Empire was a militaristic regime that controlled a large portion of the Outer Rim, and they saw humanity's inclusion as an insult. And for decades, the Krellians had been the dominant military force in the galaxy, and their fleets were unchallenged, and their will was enforced through fear, and the arrival of humanity threatened that dominance, and so the Krellians decided to make an example. They struck at a human colony on the frontier world of New Horizon, and the attack was swift and brutal, and 3 Krellian battlecruisers came down on the colony and bombarded population centers and destroyed infrastructure, and thousands of civilians died in the first hours. The distress call reached Earth within minutes, and Secretary General Harper called an emergency meeting, and Captain Morrison had been promoted to Admiral and commanded the Human Defense Fleet, and he stood before the assembled leaders. Morrison said, his voice cold with fury, that the Krellians had made a grave mistake, and they attacked civilians and murdered innocents, and they could not let this stand. Harper asked what he proposed. Morrison replied they would respond with everything they had and show the Krellians and the galaxy that humanity did not tolerate violence against the innocent, and they would deploy the fleet. Harper thought about this, and the council room was silent, and the weight of the decision hung in the air. And finally she nodded and said, do it. But she wanted this to end quickly, and they were not here to wage war, but to protect their people and to make that clear. Morrison said he understood. 72 human warships gathered near the edge of the Sol system, and it was the largest fleet humanity had ever sent, and an armada designed for one purpose, and that was overwhelming force, and at its center was the flagship Valkyrie's Fury, and it was a massive dreadnought covered in weapons and armor thick enough to take sustained fire. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge with his senior officers around him, and Commander Sophie Grant was now his second in command, and she looked at the tactical display and said they had confirmation, and the Krellian fleet was still at New Horizon with 3 battlecruisers and 12 escort frigates, and they were not expecting a response. This fast, Morrison said, good, and they would give them no time to prepare. And he told all ships to jump to hyperspace on his mark, and destination was New Horizon, and they would end this now. The fleet vanished. In a flash of light tearing through space toward the colony under attack, at New Horizon, the Krellian commander General Varkos watched the burning colony with satisfaction, and his orders had been clear, and demonstrate that defying the Krellian Empire came with consequences, and he had expected no resistance, and the humans were new and untested on this scale. Then his sensor officer shouted and said multiple hyperspace signatures were incoming, and 72 contacts, and they were human. Vessels. Varkos felt a chill and said 72, and that was impossible, and told them to raise shields and prepare to fight. The human fleet came out of hyperspace in perfect formation surrounding the Krellian ships in a sphere of steel and fire. And Morrison's voice echoed across all channels, and he said this was Admiral Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Fleet. And they had attacked a human colony and murdered civilians, and they would stand down immediately and surrender or be destroyed. And they had 60 seconds to comply. Varkos hesitated, and his pride fought with his survival instinct, and finally, he snarled and said they were the Krellian Empire, and did not bow to upstart Deathworlders, and told all ships to open fire. The Krellian fleet unleashed everything they had, and plasma and missiles filled space. But the human ships absorbed the attack, and their shields flared but held, and then they returned fire. The difference was staggering, and human weapons refined and enhanced. Over years of development tore through Krellian shields like they were nothing, and railguns fired projectiles at speeds close to light, and punched clean through armor, and missiles swarmed enemy vessels and overwhelmed their defenses and the flagship. Valkyrie's Fury unleashed its main cannon, and it was a focused beam of energy that cut the lead Krellian battlecruiser in half with a single shot. The battle, if it could even be called, that lasted less than 5 minutes, and the 3 Krellian battlecruisers were reduced to drifting wrecks, and the escort frigates tried to run, but the human fleet chased them down and disabled each one with cold precision. General Varkos aboard the broken remains of his flagship watched in horror as his fleet was torn apart, and his communications officer turned to him pale and said, "The humans were calling them." Morrison's face appeared on the screen, and his expression showed no emotion, and he said, General Varkos had his chance to surrender, and now he would answer for his crimes, and his fleet was disabled, and weapons offline, and he would remain here until Galactic Council forces arrived to take him into custody, and he would carry a message back to his empire. Varkos asked what message. Morrison said, humanity did not seek conflict, but they would not tolerate violence against the innocent and attack them again, and they would face not a fleet, but a reckoning, and they were the defenders of those who could not defend themselves, and they did not forgive those who harmed the helpless. The transmission ended, and the human fleet remained in orbit around New Horizon, helping the survivors and securing the planet, and within hours, Galactic Council forces arrived, led by Ambassador Krethar aboard a diplomatic vessel. Krethar contacted Morrison directly and said the Council was grateful for their swift response, and they had saved countless lives. Morrison replied they did what needed to be done, but this incident proved a larger point, and the galaxy needed protectors and not politicians who debated while innocents died, and they would continue to serve in that role with or without the Council's approval. Krethar said they had it, and after what they had done here, the Council would have no choice but to recognize humanity as the galaxy's foremost defenders, and they had earned that title. Morrison looked out at the stars, and the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, and humanity had taken its place in the galaxy, not through conquest or domination, but through strength guided by principle. They had become the shield for the weak and the sword against the wicked, and the galaxy, for all its fears and doubts, had no choice but to accept them, because when the SOS went out, it was not allies who answered but the Deathworlders, and they had brought their fleet of doom.